Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to present to you the Navajo Long Walk today. This presentation is from A History of New Mexico and the New Mexico Journey, which are two of the textbooks we use in our class. So the time period we're looking at is around the 1860s. During this time period, there were persistent problems in New Mexico. By the early 1860s, Americans of European descent began settling in and around Navajo lands, leading to conflict between Navajo people on one side and settlers and the U.S. Army on the other. So in our last lesson, we learned about the westward expansion, the idea of manifest destiny, and Americans moving west and into Native American lands, pushing Native Americans off their lands and taking over their land. The Navajos and Apaches did not accept Spanish, Mexican, or American rule. Raids continued, treaties were made but broken, there was no trust, forts were built on Navajo grazing lands. The Civil War was going on during this time. During the war, raids increased. Forts were abandoned when soldiers were off fighting in the war. After the war, more settlers moved in. Native Americans felt threatened. They were losing more land, and Americans were killing thousands of buffalo. Americans and Native American groups continued to fight. With the new government, there was a new policy created, the idea of reservations, and this reservation policy was established. The idea of reservations was to keep Native American groups to a confined space to stop attacks. The government promised it would protect those who would promise to live on reservations. They were told they would be provided food and shelter, and on reservations they would be able to learn ideas, customs, language, religion, and culture of Americans. This idea is known as assimilation. This was another primary reason for the reservation policy. As the United States grew in population, more land was needed for expansion west of the Mississippi. It was believed that if natives could be assimilated into Western culture, they would abandon what Americans thought as savage lifestyles. The policy reflected the United States' interest in gaining resources. They were interested in water, minerals, land, and natural resources that they would get from taking over these new lands. With assimilation, they're also basically changing one culture to another culture. So the U.S. government not only wanted to confine Native Americans to one space, but they wanted them to become Americanized. This is similar to the Great Missionary Period, when the Spanish were forcing their culture upon the Pueblo people. The U.S. government wanted Native Americans to abandon their traditions and culture while adopting an American way of life. So forcing American culture on Native Americans. This included clothing, religion, language, and beliefs. To illustrate assimilation, here's a couple of images. So again, one goal at this time was to force this new culture on the population that had already been living here. Another example. The Navajo was the largest and most powerful tribe by the time of the Civil War. Americans came in, raids increased, so U.S. Army General Carleton put this man, Kit Carson, in charge of ending raids, the Navajo and Apache raids. Carson was a well-known mountain man, trail guide, and soldier. According to our text, it said he wanted to round up the Navajos peacefully, but once they resisted, that his actions were not so peaceful. Not peaceful by any means. He turned to scorched earth policy once the Navajo did not surrender. Scorched earth policy was the deliberate destruction of everything belonging to the enemy. The goal here was to force the enemy to surrender. Carson and his troops set fire to Navajo homes, crops, and killed livestock. Without animals or crops, the Navajo would not survive the winter. Once their home was basically burned, Carson and his soldiers forced the Navajo to leave their homeland at gunpoint. So the Navajos surrendered, their land's burned, they have no livestock, they have no crops. Hoping to get shelter and supplies from the Americans, they surrender. 9,000 Navajos became prisoner. That's when they were forced to, by gunpoint, leave their homeland to this new reservation. This was what began, and this began their long walk to a reservation at Fort Sumner. This is known as the Navajo Long Walk. Here on this map, this area in red is to identify the historical Navajo lands. So historically, Navajo people were from the Four Corners area. On the Long Walk, over 300 Navajos died. They died from extreme cold, starvation, and disease. Those too sick or weak to continue were often shot and killed by soldiers or left behind. This wasn't just happening in New Mexico. This was happening all over the U.S. So this image is actually supposed to be a depiction of the Trail of Tears, which was happening in the East. All over America, there was a forced removal of Native Americans from their homelands to these newly created reservations. And it was in terrible conditions. Many were killed. In New Mexico, the Navajo moved to the Bosque Redondo, which was near Fort Sumner. When they arrived, the land was dry and it was empty. They arrived and found the Mescalero Apaches had already been relocated there as well. Now these two old enemies were forced to live together. The Comanche were raiding this reservation. Because the land was so terrible, their crops failed. The little water that they did have on this reservation made animals and people sick. After living on the reservation for a while, eventually in 1868, General Sherman met with the Navajos for the national government. An offer was made that if the Navajos promised not to fight, they could choose where to live. The Navajos returned to their homeland. So even though they got to choose where they wanted to live, they still didn't have their complete freedom. They still are on a reservation. The government created the Navajo Reservation, and Navajos stopped raiding New Mexico settlements. This is an image here to show the new boundaries of the Navajo Reservation. It is where their traditional homeland was. And as a result of the treaty in 1868, there was a conflict between the Hopi and the Navajo about land and boundaries. So this is how the Hopi Reservation ended up also within the Navajo Reservation. Here, this is to show you where Fort Sumner is. The Bosque Redondo was close to Fort Sumner. So think about the Navajo being forced out of their homeland up here in the Four Corners to walk by gunpoint in terrible conditions all the way to this new reservation. consequences of the United States policy directed at Native Americans. So this new policy of reservations and relocating Native Americans to these reservations. It's estimated that millions of Native peoples were killed, displaced, and relocated from their indigenous homelands to make way for a growing nation of the United States. The policy directed at assimilation resulted in many outcomes. So the that forced culture and getting rid of their culture led to many negative outcomes, including massive language loss, extinction of traditional and ceremonial practices, and migration of large populations into urban areas. So for part 2 of this assignment, I want you to start brainstorming. Put yourself in their shoes. How would you feel or respond having to go through what the Navajo endured at this time? So think about outsiders coming in, telling you you have to move from your home that you've always been on because basically they're moving in. How would that make you feel? How would you respond? What evidence supports those feelings or your response, what your response would be? You're going to then move on to step 2 of this assignment in Google Classroom to share some of those thoughts in a creative way.